So my name is Tan. Thank you all for coming, people who regularly come and new people as well. My name's Tan, and this is our latest Kumi Now online gathering. Today's topic will be on anti-Semitism, and we're joined today by Ellis. Now, the first part of our meeting will be dedicated to our guests, but please stay around after they leave, as we'll be dedicating the rest of the hour into action as we engage in advocacy for Palestine. With that said, I also know today is election day in the US. So thank you for being here if you're calling in from the US. So I know it's a tough time. And I think, we can have some conversation during the advocacy time as well. Jonathan Katab from FOSNA recently released a reflection on about the election. So if you want to read that on FOSNA's website, that's there. And of course, regardless of who wins, we know that we need to continue to build a better world. And we're really thankful at Sabeel for the community at Kumi that continues to show up every week and do this work with us. So before I start, I'd like to remind you that this recording or this session is being recorded. It will be shared after the event. So please make sure your mic is off. But if you have questions for Aaron during the presentation, you can put that in the chat and I'll make sure to relay the questions during the Q&A session. So just to introduce Aaron before they speak, Aaron Ellis is an organizer, activist, artist, and scholar who holds a PhD in theater and performance studies and an MA in religion, ethics, and philosophy, and facilitates courageous conversations and somatic workshops centering social justice. They co-create Jewish and inclusive ritual practice that centers social justice and speaks truth to power through art, theory, and practice. And I believe you're currently teaching as well, right, in theater and religious studies. And Aaron's father is also the late Mark Ellis, who was a dear friend of Sabeel. Aaron is also a dear friend of Sabeel. So with that said, it's an honor to have Aaron with us to talk on this topic and just reflect with us. So Aaron, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Tan. And I would like to begin by thanking Sabeel and Tan and the whole team and all of you assembled here for your witness. As many of you probably know, for decades now, Sabeel has carried a witness to the Christian world and beyond, and doing such important work, especially in Christian communities where they walk a tough line. Sabeel and other Christian liberationists who call for justice and peace in historic Palestine have to contend with historic anti-Semitism in basic Christian theology. Christianity is certainly not a monolith, and yet there are trends across Christian history that have long held Jews in an ambivalent position. Jews have been seen as both fundamental and foundational to the emergence of Christianity through the assumption of Jewish scripture, through the Jewishness of Jesus, the Palestinian, and also through the theological development of Christian doctrines of exclusivity. Jews are figured as Christ killers, as blind to the saving power of Jesus, and thus as damned. Christian Zionism takes this one step further by instrumentalizing Jewish desires for self-determination in the form of Zionism and supporting the colonial Jewish settlement of historic Palestine and the establishment of a Jewish state there. The hope of Christian Zionists and their belief is that amassing Jews in historic Palestine is a precursor for the second coming of Christ and a necessary condition for what is spelled out in the Christian book of Revelation, the rapture of believers and the judgment of non-believers, including the mass of Jews assembled in Palestine, culminating in hellfire, brimstone, and damnation. Palestinian Christians and organizations like Sabeel walk this fine line, especially because they carry the weight of these centuries of Christian anti-Semitism, but also because they are doubly beset by the ascendancy of Jews and indigenous Palestinian resistance to the first modern Jewish state in the form of Israel. So not only are they carrying this history, but they're also up against the move for, quote, Jewish empowerment after the Holocaust in Palestine. Since the Holocaust, we have seen righteous demands for Christian accountability to the impacts of Christian anti-Semitism and calls for theological transformation to purge Christian theology and institutions of longstanding anti-Semitism. At the same time, historic and ongoing anti-Semitism have been used to justify the creation of the State of Israel, and critics of the founding of the state, critics of the Nakba, and critics of ongoing Israeli policies toward Palestinians have been labeled anti-Semitic. Palestinians specifically, and Arabs and Muslims more generally, have since been seen by some, a loud and influential set of voices, even if a minority, as embodying the potential for another Holocaust. Thus, Israel, the only Jewish state, the only Jewish military power, is figured as necessary, even if imperfect, to guard against Jews' deepest, darkest fear, that there will be another Holocaust, and that it will happen soon, that it could happen any minute now. This marks a noticeable shift in trends of anti-Semitism, from the old anti-Semitism, conventional anti-Semitism, to this new anti-Semitism. But I believe there's also a strong mark of continuity and anti-Semitic tropes and the violence that it inspires between the old vision of anti-Semitism and this new, so-called new anti-Semitism. Both anti-Semitism and the weaponization of anti-Semitism against critics of Israel, um, critics of their settler colonialism, critics of their ethnocratic nationalism, their policies and practices, all of these things, both anti-Semitism and the critique of criticism of Israel, both maintain a monolithic vision of Jewish identity, Jewish peoplehood, and Jewish destiny, as if Jews are one thing. What we might call conventional anti-Semitism not only includes the strictly Christian dogma of figuring Jews as blind and damned, superseded by Christian revelation and forthcoming salvation, but it also includes such tropes as Jews being bloodthirsty and child killers, lustful and sexually deviant, untrustworthy and with ultimate allegiance to Jews above all others, miserly penny pinchers and greedy usurers, controlling global and local finance, unaccountable and all-powerful, pulling the strings of power from behind the scenes and manipulating the world order to benefit Jews to the detriment of non-Jews. These examples of historic anti-Semitic tropes that continue today have been used to support legal and interpersonal discrimination against Jews, to call for and justify collective violence against Jews, from pogroms to death camps. And like I said, these conventional anti-Semitic tropes and the violence that come along with them persists. Despite Vatican II and widespread Christian repentance, theological and institutional transformation after the Holocaust, one does not have to look far to find latent or explicit examples of anti-Semitism. In my own life, I have witnessed it. I remember as a young child, probably 6 or 7 years old, growing up in Croton-on-Hudson, New York, standing in line at a grocery store. The man in front of us tried to buy his groceries, but his credit card was declined. He asked to try it again. It was declined. He tried another card. It was declined. He asked to try it again. And when nothing worked, he screamed, "Effing Jews!" As a high schooler in Waco, Texas, from swastika graffiti drawn in my notebooks to being told anti-Semitic jokes by people not realizing that I was Jewish, um, I experienced it in very quote unquote minor ways. When I took my driver's education course to obtain my driver's license, I remember our driving teacher at the end of the class instructed us to, when we buy a car, not to take their first price, but instead to haggle. He told us, quote, "You got to Jew them down, get a better price." It was the first time I had ever heard the word Jew as a verb. For all the 12 years I spent in Texas, I was consistently witnessed to in the bookstore, at the cafe, in the gas station, walking on the street, at school. Do you know Jesus? As a graduate student doing my dissertation research in New York City, I encountered it. People told me things like, whenever something is going terribly wrong, you can bet a Jew is behind it. And oh, look at that nose. Yeah, you got money. You'll be all right. Since I was 13 years old, I have also experienced being told that I am anti-Semitic for speaking up and out against Israel's treatment of Palestinians. I have been called a self-hating Jew. I have been called a capo, a word used to refer to Jews who, during the Holocaust, collaborated with the Nazis, a complicated history for sure. I have been called a traitor, told that I'm not really Jewish, and more. This phenomena of calling critics of Israel anti-Semitic is often called the new anti-Semitism. It is not the old trope of people claiming Jews are monsters or claiming Jews are damned to hell. Rather, it is simply criticizing the Jewish state. This new anti-Semitism has, over the last decade, been codified by the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and continues to be adopted by international bodies, NGOs, national and local governments, as well as colleges and universities, for example, in the so-called United States. The IHRA definition continues to grow despite the once widely reported cautionary warning from one of the authors of the definition, Ken Stern, who said that this definition, when used inappropriately, can limit free speech. The definition itself, as adopted by the IHRA in Bucharest in 2015, reads, quote, "Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and/or their property, toward Jewish community institution, and religious facilities." The proposal adopted by the IHRA continues with further explanation and examples of what exactly constitutes and does not constitute anti-Semitism. It reads, quote, "Manifestations might include the targeting of the State of Israel, conceived as a Jewish collectivity. However, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic." So at the center of this very definition is an ambivalence, where criticizing a state can also be viewed as targeting it. And whether or not it's conceived of as a Jewish collectivity is a matter of fact and not really a matter of opinion, it being a Jewish state and an ethnocratic state. Um, and then the question of other countries and whether or not other countries' criticisms are at the same level of those criticisms of Israel. Following the definition, the IHRA outlines several examples of what it claims to be anti-Semitic, including, quote, "denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Applying double standards by requiring of it a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. Drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis." End quote. So those are some examples the IHRA gives of what would constitute anti-Semitism. It's interesting to note, just as an aside, that Hillel International, many years before the adoption of the IHRA definition in Bucharest, had already basically put out these guidelines for its own student organizations that they could not partner with or host any speaker that delegitimizes Israel, questions Israel's legitimacy and right to exist, or that applies any kind of double standard to the state of Israel. So this kind of attack on free speech in support of peace and justice in Israel-Palestine pre-exists the IHRA definition. But in any case, these examples, which are now being taken up by large international bodies as well as local bodies, underscore the danger of the definition, namely that it can be used to stifle free and protected speech that is not directed at Jews for being Jewish, but is rather directed at the state. Therefore, this definition itself lumps all Jews together as a monolith, as if Israel somehow stands in for all Jews. The fact that certain types of criticism of Israel warrant the label anti-Semitism already implies that Israel stands for, represents, and in some sense constitutes, and therefore encompasses Jewish identities around the world. Instead of combating anti-Semitism, this definition and its examples play into anti-Semitic tropes which universally treat Jews as monolith, guilty by association and affiliation and allegiance to one another. And even more dangerous for Jews is that in this vision of a monolithic Zionist Judaism, all Jews around the world are now seen as universally supporting, if not supporting, at least complicit and benefiting from Israeli policies and practices. Again, guilty by association and affiliation and allegiance to one another. The definition itself falling under its own definition of anti-Semitism. The IHRA says it is anti-Semitic to, quote, accuse Jews as a people of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or group. Again, I want to emphasize this. By conflating Jews and the State of Israel, the IHRA definition enables and emboldens anti-Semitism by reducing Jews to Zionism, to a monolith that is demonstrably responsible for severe, ongoing, and purposeful human rights abuses from 1948 until today, including, but not limited to, forced displacement and ethnic cleansing, arbitrary detention and torture of civilians, including children, home demolition, land theft, and deprivation of access to basic resources, including farmland, fishing in the sea, accessing fresh water, and more. So while the IHRA, as well as anti-Semitic tropes, tend to paint Jews as a monolith, we might only survey principled Jewish criticism of the State of Israel to find that the IHRA definition and examples are problematic and basically inadequate to the task for which they were created, which is identifying and eradicating anti-Semitism. Just a few examples. Ilan Pappé, famed Jewish Israeli historian, describes the Nakba of 1948 as ethnic cleansing. The very foundation of the state consisted of a racialized, Eurocentric, Ashkenazi-centric, white-centric, Judeo-centric ethnic cleansing. Does this qualify as a, quote, racist endeavor, as the first example of the IHRA definition that I cited? Or does it merely report historical facts and describe a historical process by which the State of Israel came to exist? The claim of anti-Semitism is, of course, an easy way to deflect a conversation about those facts on the ground and to escalate the necessary political discourse to a level of disciplining and punishing as opposed to actual discourse. Now, on this claims of a double standard. Are any other democratic nations involved in over 50 years of military occupation widespread human rights violation? Every reputable large-scale international human rights agency, as well as the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem and other Israeli NGOs and advocacy groups, not to mention Al-Haq and Palestinian groups, report on the brutality of Israeli repression in militarily occupied territories of the West Bank and the more or less regularly bombed Gaza Strip, which has been bombed regularly more or less since Israeli settlers were unilaterally withdrawn in 2005. Of course, if we are going to be critical of any state that practices repression and violence, we should be critical of all of them. But when it's used as a deflection, it is basically meant to say, don't criticize Israel. Even if the person criticizing Israel would also criticize other nations, the United States, for example, for being founded on settler colonialism and racism. The two are obviously not exclusive, and so the claim of the double standard is often this bad faith effort to just deflect conversation and to bring about an accusation of anti-Semitism. And what of this comparing the State of Israel to the Nazis? Jews themselves have been drawing comparisons between the policies and actions of the State of Israel and those of the Nazis since the founding of the state. Reports from the Knesset floor attest to this fact, quoted and cited by Jewish historian of 1948, Benny Morris. And now, 50 years later, Jewish performance art activist Yael Bartana and founder of the Jewish Israeli organization Zochrot, Eitan Bronstein, created a performance art film where they mimicked the annual speech given by every Israeli president marking at Yad Vashem, marking the state opening ceremony of Holocaust Martyrs and Heroes Remembrance Day. In their satirical speech, these Jewish Israeli activists actually give thanks to the Holocaust for giving Israel the opportunity to exist, to take all this land, to make all this space for Jews, and to be so great. It is satire, and it is biting, and it is a direct impeachment of Israel's use and abuse of the memory of the Holocaust to justify and further entrench its policies and practices vis-a-vis the Palestinian people. It is a direct comparison between Nazis and the State of Israel. More recently, when Israeli parliament passed a law in 2010 requiring a loyalty oath to the State of Israel as a Jewish state, Zochrot mounted a protest by setting loudspeakers amidst the Israeli public, blaring a reading of the loyalty oath that was passed by the Israeli Knesset, but read aloud in German, reminding of the propagandistic speeches of Hitler that now resound in the Jewish subconscious internationally. Again, directly comparing Israeli and Nazi policies and practices. In the much more recent aftermath of October 7th, Jews around the world, including those affiliated with Jewish activist organizations and those unaffiliated, have taken up the cry, "Never again is now." The slogan draws inspiration from one prominent lesson that Jewish ethicists, theologians, and laypeople lift up from the intergenerational trauma of the Holocaust. Never again. And never again for anyone. By saying never again is now, Jews today are explicitly comparing the Nazi state and the Jewish state. Are these Jews anti-Semitic? Does it become anti-Semitic if a non-Jew says these things? It's an absurdity, and yet it has become the virtual law of the land. Actual anti-Semitic attacks, like the murderous assault on the Tree of Life Synagogue in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and escalated anti-Semitism on the political right in general, for example, in the so-called United States, receives far less attention and concern than the, quote, new anti-Semitism codified by the IHRA. It was only after large-scale protests against the Israeli assault on Gaza after October 7th that the federal government of the United States under the Biden-Harris administration created a national strategy to counter anti-Semitism. Not after the shooting at the synagogue, not after a gunman took a rabbi hostage in a synagogue in Texas, not after the Holocaust has this ever happened. Only now, when the state of Israel is under 24/7 scrutiny for its devastating impact being live streamed and reported to the world. Colleges and universities in the so-called US have also followed suit in creating unprecedented conditions to oppose student and faculty speech on the issue of Israel's ongoing bombardment of Gaza. While current protesters, organizers, and people at university encampments make direct parallels and connections to previous university movements unrelated to the State of Israel, um, and the repression that those movements face from the police and from college administration, there seems to be a heightened level of scrutiny and discipline when the culprit being called out is a protester against the State of Israel's actions. Not only have college administrators put out significantly one-sided statements calling for prayers and protection for Jewish students, not only Israelis, of course, but all Jews, while also not calling for prayers and protection for Palestinians or for Palestinian students, even as the body count mounts and even as Palestinians on college campuses face increasing repression over their voicing their own opinions about this issue. There is an over-policing of Palestinian voices, Palestinian symbols like the keffiyeh, and this has amounted to or culminated in brute force of campus and city police to disrupt and violently disperse these peaceful protests and encampments. Maura Finkelstein, a tenured professor at Muhlenberg College, was fired, her tenure overturned for posting a Palestinian poet's words criticizing Zionism and Zionists. While she is appealing the university's decision, it is still so obviously underscoring the issue here. Anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionist Jews exist, and this would operate as a contradiction under the IHRA's definition, but it is unaccounted for, and it is unreconciled in its adoption and in its application. Mainstream media in the so-called USA, including CNN and PBS, have since October 7th reported on the experience of Jewish students on college campuses, meaning that they interview Jewish students who feel threatened by these anti-genocide protests. But they do not interview the countless Jewish student organizers, some anti-Zionist, some non-Zionist, who are helping organize these very protests. On August 8th of 2024, the state of Florida's Commissioner of Education Manny Diaz Jr., sent a memo to Florida college system presidents requesting, quote, an examination of course descriptions and syllabi in an effort to review classes for any anti-Semitic or anti-Israel bias, end quote. The letter requires presidents of public colleges and universities throughout the state of Florida to, quote, identify all classes being offered this academic year that contain the following terms in course syllabi or in course description: Israel, Israeli, Palestine, Palestinian, Middle East, Zionism, Zionist, Judaism, Jewish, or Jews. The order from the Department of Education further instructs college and university presidents to report these classes to the state, after which the DOE will create a course inventory and distribute the course inventory to all colleges, and order that college and universities review all instructional material utilized in each course listed in the inventory to identify anti-Semitism or anti-Israel bias. Of course, the DOE's review indicates extreme bias on the part of the state and its officials and imparts that bias to the colleges and university administrations. Their search obviously and intentionally leaves out any care or concern for anti-Palestinian, Islamophobic, or anti-Arab material in those classes. That is not what they are screening for. They are screening for anti-Jewish and anti-Israel bias, according to their letter. This one-sided slant tells us up front that the state and its officials are passing on a political agenda to their college and university presidents and using the state's purview over public education to impose their own ideological agenda. The ideological nature of the order, just to put a finer point on it, is evident from the fact that although Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims have been targeted with hate speech and hate crimes across Florida for a long time, and although neo-Nazis have assembled and made transparent threats against LGBTQ+, Jewish and Palestinian and Arab and Muslim communities, the state of Florida has never requested such a review. They've never requested syllabi to ensure that anti-Palestinian rhetoric, anti-Arab racism, anti-Blackness, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, or anti-Semitism were not being taught in these institutions until now, until the state of Israel is under heightened scrutiny, and at a time when Jews across the world and others are standing up in much greater numbers than ever before to oppose the state of Israel and its long-standing practices and policies against the Palestinian people. All of these modes to control the discourse, to discipline and punish people who step out of line and criticize Israel by calling them anti-Semitic, plays into the tropes of anti-Semitism, age old, that Jews are disproportionately powerful, that they are able to control the levers of power, that they have access to decision makers and can influence politics as well as economics for their own benefit to the exclusion of others, and that there is death involved in this, and actual bloodletting and the killing of children. And here we confront what thousands upon thousands of Palestinian children have been killed. So we have this conundrum where Jews are standing up, speaking out, others are standing up, speaking out, and we also have these larger power structures that are condemning that speaking out. I'm going to end with just one brief story because I think that it's important to also highlight this question of anti-Semitism among Palestinians. And I just have a personal anecdote to share the complexity of that question with everyone. And then I'll turn it over for any questions anyone might have. When I was in historic Palestine for the first time, 2005, I went with the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, ICAD, which has a long time been rebuilding Palestinian homes that have been demolished by the IDF, and trying to protect homes from being demolished. The group was co-founded by a Palestinian man, Salim Shawambre, and a Jewish guy, Jeff Halper, a professor of anthropology and Minnesotan, who my father would say that his actual greatest claim to fame is that he attended Bob Dylan's bar mitzvah in Minnesota. Yeah, which is big. So I was there on the building site, and we had taken a break for the day after building the house, after building part of the house. And there was a researcher there from Denmark, I believe, who was doing their thesis or dissertation on the impact of home demolitions on the nuclear Palestinian family structure. Like, what are the impact of demolitions on the Palestinian family? And they invited me to go with them to meet one of the people that they are interviewing for their project. And I said, sure. So I went and we sat with a woman on the foyer of her demolished home, literally the beautiful tile beneath our feet and the rubble all around us, no walls standing, entirely demolished. And her small daughter served us tea as we talked. And after a while of talking, we had been speaking in English. I did not speak Arabic. And after a while of talking, I got her story, that at least part of it, that her home had been demolished several times, that the first time it had been demolished, she was pregnant and she experienced a miscarriage. And that a couple of years later, when she had been pregnant again, her home had been demolished again, and she carried the pregnancy to term, but the baby was born in stillbirth. And, I was so struck by meeting this woman, the kind of glint and light in her eyes, the way that she laughed in our conversation, the way that she served us tea and was so sweet and caring to her little daughter, and that she was also so strong just in her face and her features. Um, But, I started to cry and I told her, as a citizen of the so-called United States, as a Jewish person, I have to apologize. I know it doesn't do much, but I want to apologize. And there was a moment of confusion. She didn't understand what I was saying. I couldn't explain it. She couldn't understand what I was saying. So we called over the researcher to interpret for us. And it turned out that she didn't believe or could not compute that I was Jewish. Because, she said, I was not there in a uniform with the gun or with the bulldozer ready to destroy her home. When you have a Jewish state with a Star of David on the flag and the language is Hebrew and it's a Jewish state for Jews, and you make people sign a loyalty oath to the state as a Jewish state, and the Jewish majority of this Jewish state is predicated on the exclusion of the millions of non-Jews who lived there and lived there before the creation of the state of Israel. The question of anti-Semitism for Palestinians is a misplaced question. If it had been a Muslim state, if it had been a Hindu state, if it had been a Christian state, would the resistance of Palestinians and their feelings toward their colonizers be any different? Um, so I leave you with that question and gratitude for your time and for your ongoing witness in your own lives, and for Sabeel for making this possible and doing it regularly, always.
Thank you, Erin, so much, and for sharing the stories as well, along with your presentation. They were really powerful, and I think Reverend Fahad made a good point, because I know last time we went a little over time because we got into more of a discussion than Q&A. So if you want to raise your hand and you have a specific question, that's fine. But if it's more of a discussion, we can do that more after the Q&A. One question I'll ask while people put their questions in the chat is, I know based on your own work, you mentioned a little bit about your practices and your activism and also your art. And I would love to hear some reflections about what prophetic Judaism looks like for you and your practice, and then what maybe a Jewish identity beyond Zionism has and can look like, based on just your own experiences and your own activism and work.
Okay, thank you, Tan. I'll take that as like a two-part question. One about one about the prophetic, and then one about what does continuing this work look like in practice in activism and organizing. And feel free to follow up if I miss it. Um, so, prophetic Judaism is just like all progressive and radical ideas, easily susceptible to co-optation and domestication. I think that's first and foremost. Prophetic Judaism for me is about escalation of resistance to injustice. An escalation of resistance to injustice can look like a lot of things. It can be practiced by people of all sorts with all different abilities and backgrounds and capacities and skill sets. Um, and so it's hard to say what prophetic Judaism looks like other than to say it is escalatory. Without an escalation toward justice, then no matter how progressive the piety, it is resolved into the status quo, which I think is a challenge for me as somebody who lifts up this idea of prophetic possibilities, that we all have the possibility to live and embody the prophetic in our own ways. Um, and it's a challenge to liberationists who hold up the idea of the prophetic and who hold up the idea of collective liberation, because sometimes we get we find ourselves in institutional contexts that invite and encourage us to remain basically conformists, even if we maintain a progressive line. So I think it's a self-reflective question for us all here. What does the prophetic look like? How do we follow it in our own lives? What steps can we take toward escalation? Realizing and recognizing that that will be different for everybody based on our own abilities and capacities, and also it will be different based on our timelines and where we are in our lives and who's around us and what conversation partners we have access to. So that's a tried to be a short answer, but didn't turn out too short. And what it looks like in practice with organizing toward the future that we want to see is that it is absolutely intersectional and interdependent. And without it being collective, it is for naught. You know, we see this move toward militarizing campus police to protect against anti-Semitism, militarizing Jewish campus spaces to protect against anti-Semitism, as if militarization keeps us safe. You know, when in fact it simply isolates Jewish students, it pits them against non-Jewish students who also need protection, probably need more protection than Jewish students. Especially, I'm thinking about Black students, brown students, students of color, trans students. Um, and so, again, this kind of thing that is separatist reinforces anti-Semitic tropes and deepens the problem of anti-Semitism while trying to solve it, but ultimately failing to do so. What I see around the world, around me, and not only around me where I am in Lenapehoking, New York City, but also even in the Deep South, is I see Palestinian liberation being more directly connected to other struggles for liberation by people who may not have ever really heard much about Palestine or understood much about it, or who may have said in the past, oh, that's just like been like that for thousands of years or something, which, you know, is not true. Um, so I think what I'm seeing is a deepening need for this intersectional and interdependent collective pursuit of liberation.
Awesome. Thank you, Aaron. And someone asked a question about what advice or suggestions you can offer us when engaging with Jews and Jewish communities. And also, I think the second part to your question is also um, those wanting to engage and then those willing to face the elephant in the room in interfaith work and interfaith dialogue. And I think that's a entirely different topic, but that might be something you can also reflect on in terms of especially like interfaith dialogue being an equal weapon. Sometimes, like you could see it in the Abraham Accords, for example, a few years back, in the Middle East, but also in the US being used like that. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And they are kind of two different questions, and I also want to kind of find a through line in them. I think that the most important thing that people can do with regard to anti-Semitism or claims of anti-Semitism for Palestine solidarity, um, whether it's in a specifically Jewish context or if it's in an interfaith context, is to uplift anti-Zionist and non-Zionist Jewish voices. From Martin Buber and Hannah Arendt, from Bernard Lazare, um, Mark Ellis, you know. Um, and also, I think it's so important too that we not rely on these, okay, we call them geniuses. Dad would like that. But, these like kind of figures that are elevated, lifted up, like they're these striking individuals that crash through the whole thing. There is a place for such striking individuals, Malcolm, Martin, Abraham Joshua Heschel, there's a place for them, Edward Said, right? But of course, we know that like just because there is an Edward Said doesn't mean there isn't also this large community of Palestinian intellectual and, incredibly engaged and creative and thoughtful, people doing all kinds of work in those fields in their own terms. And the same is true of anti-Zionist Judaism. There are Jews all over who are excluded from institutional Jewish spaces and who start to create their own. So, for example, I've been working now with Judaism on Our Own Terms, Joot, OOT, formerly Open Hillel, who, when Hillel adopted their 3Ds, you can't do anything that disparages or double standard or delegitimizes the state of Israel, or BDS, advocacy, Jewish students said, all right, well, let's change Hillel because this isn't working. And so there are Jewish student groups all over Turtle Island and beyond that are holding their own anti-Zionist Shabbat, that are holding their own anti-Zionist Sukkah, for Sukkot, who built it on their campuses and who it was bulldozed, and trashed by the campus police just, recently for Sukkot. Um, and of course you have large groups too, like Jewish Voice for Peace in the United States, like if not now in the United States, like IJV in Canada, and like Na'amod in England, and like you know, Jewish-led organizations even in Palestine, like Zokrot, like ICAD. You have Israeli groups like B'Tselem, but finding Israeli and Israeli refuseniks, who are conscientious objectors. So I think it's a great asset to be able to tap into those anti-Zionist Jewish voices who are doing that work for us, articulating their perspective from a Jewish context, so that we can know and let others know that Judaism is not a monolith.
Thank you, Erin. Reverend Fahed, you have your hand raised if you want to speak. I think you're muted, Reverend Fahed. Can you hear me? Okay, awesome.
Erin, I want to thank you and thank Sabil, because Sabil is the first organization that introduced me to your dad, and we hosted your father many times in the holy city of Atlanta. So it's hear you. I remember seeing you with many pictures with your dad, and especially during the memorial service. I have two questions. Question number one, every time I speak to an audience, especially in a church, uh, I'm a retired Presbyterian minister. I always make the following definition, and I'd like for you to help me with it. One, that there is a difference between Judaism, Israel, and Zionism. I always say Judaism is the fate of 15 million Jews, give and take, that live more than 100 countries. Israel established in 1948, but not above the law. And Zionism is the issue that want uh, the land for the Jewish people of the world without the Palestinians and so forth. So I put emphasis on Zionism and the policy of the state of Israel. You know, I grew up in the Galilee area. My mother language was Arabic, then the second language was Hebrew, and the third language is English. But from 1948 to 1966, I couldn't leave my village without getting a permit from the Israeli military to leave my village. So immediately, Israel in 1948 created 63 laws to control our lives in movement, in health, labor, and everything. The real question I want to ask you, the second question, is after October 7, 1,000 black preachers signed a letter in the New York Times saying we need calling the president for ceasefire. We took those 4 people who signed from the 1,000 black preachers to and came with 155 black preachers. The thing that I'm not able to understand inside the psyche of a white preacher and a rabbi, why they are silenced until now about what Israel is doing in Gaza. I'm not able to understand it. So I need for you to help me to go inside the psyche of a rabbi and psyche of a white preacher. Why in the hell they are not saying,
Yeah. Thank you so much, Reverend, for your remembering of my father and for your witness and for your questions. I mean, this is something, a question that I have been asking myself, and I have heard people asking themselves since before October 7th also, with the construction of the wall, for example, this like 30-foot high, 3 feet thick concrete wall that's taking land and is encircling entire Palestinian villages, and it's automated, and it's like, how can the world stand for that? How can anybody see this and not say anything? The white phosphorus raining over Gaza. How can the people, Um, so I struggle because I try not to be surprised when people don't speak out because it's not good for my heart, you know? I need to fight and I don't need my heart beating for the people who are not fighting. But it's unavoidable. I share your question and your outrage about why people are not standing up. I think that there's something to do with timeline and with culture that is not a light switch that can be turned on or off. Like the apartheid in South Africa, Martin Luther King Jr. first spoke out about that in the 1950s. And it was obvious then. It was already obvious. But it took until, it took many decades, 30 years for apartheid to fall. And it took decisive and collective action from everybody everywhere to shift the dialogue, and it only could happen at a certain point. I don't know what the objective turning point was, but honestly, I think that one of the important things it has to do is with culture and cultural boycott. You know, when as long as the Israelis are still able to compete at the Olympics, I think we will still hear silence. As long as it's normalized that Israel is just a state like any other, protecting itself, it will continue with silence. I think that's one answer. It's a major component. And I think that another answer is that there is also a lot of fear and there is a lot of control for people who don't want these rabbis and these pastors to speak out about this stuff. I know that there's pressure on academics to not speak out for the same reasons. Pressure on, I was just speaking with a rabbi, you know, we were arrested together in DC. And, you know, but he can't tell nothing to the board of his synagogue. You know, the rabbi himself went across the country to go get arrested to say something, but he can't go home and talk to the board of his synagogue because he will be fired. And then the question is also like, who are these people not saying something out loud, and what are they saying behind the scenes? Because you don't know what they are doing. Maybe they want to keep their job because they think it's the best way to advocate, or maybe they want to keep their job because they want to keep their house, and it's got nothing to do with advocacy. So I'm not sure. There are many reasons, but I think that what will give people permission to speak up and what might invite a new revelation in people is a widespread movement at every point, especially in culture. I think is the most important.
Very good. That's helpful.
Thank you, Aaron. Trying to see if there's other questions here that I may have missed. I think Randy just had a question maybe about you know, today being the US election, and if you have any thoughts on the impact of Arab and Palestinian activist responses to Harris and Walt's campaign, or just like other things about the election. Yeah, so if you have any thoughts on that.
Mm. Any thoughts on Palestinian and Arab resistance as it relates to the election?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, as we know in the so-called United States, resistance in a time of election is a complicated situation. I mean, we all remember in 2000 when, you know, Al Gore and George Bush were the presidential candidates, and of course, Ralph Nader and the Green Party. And Bush won, and people blamed Nader. And so there's this idea of spoiling in an election. And this largely has silenced, I think, opposition to Democrats from the left. Or it's been a big obstacle. When you add to that the kind of treatment by the Democratic Party of Palestinians and not letting this Palestinian representative speak at the Democratic National Convention, and Kamala Harris not willing to say basically anything except for, you know, so sorry, you know, too bad, so sad, you know, Israel will always be strong, if I may paraphrase her. It's a difficult and it's an uphill battle. The non-committed movement has been the most prominent in my circulation, the most prominent Palestinian and Arab-led effort to try to bring the protest to the election. But it's put the movement in a difficult situation because it's not really the case that the movement thinks that Donald Trump will have a better policy, you know, so it's kind of set up to, I don't know what's going to happen, but it's put in a very difficult place, and it's basically been dismissed by mainstream media and downplayed, you know, as if the, you know, so-called left in this country really have no big qualm with Kamala Harris, and it's basically been quiet on criticizing her, when actually people are showing up to all her events. with signs and with keffiyehs, and Jews are showing up and non-Jews, Palestinians and Arabs, everybody together. So I think that the most powerful and sustained Palestinian and Arab-led resistance is really not related to the election, but it's cultural, which I think is so important. I mean, it would be one thing if we could sway a candidate in an election season to actually take a position, but with the APAC and with, politics in the so-called United States as they are, that doesn't seem like a reasonable, it doesn't seem manageable. But I see things like, for example, an interfaith queer Juma at Stonewall in New York City, Lenape where you have a Palestinian-led Juma call to prayer, Muslim call to prayer, with interfaith leaders, including a rabbi and a Jewish security team surrounding the perimeter of the park so that Muslims can pray the Juma together, not separated by, gender or whatever, um, in a call for a ceasefire. These are the things that I'm seeing. I'm seeing incredible cultural events like that even existed before October 7th, like Pal Fest and like my dear friend Hind Shafani organizes this thing, Poeticians, these kind of cultural events that bring people together to invite them in to understand what is Palestinian culture, what is collective liberation in a cultural framework that is inclusive and that can lift up something to affirm. Because it's easy to say, don't vote for them, don't vote for them. No, 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 they're not right, they're not right. But I think that what Palestinian and what I'm seeing Palestinian and Arab organizers and cultural organizers doing is creating these alternative spaces for exploring the power of community, the power of togetherness, the power of collective liberation discourse through the arts, through rhetoric, through um, you know, theory and through practice, these and through ritual, and through repurposing our community's resources to not be gatekeepers for the state violence and to not be apologists for genocide, but actually to be for collective liberation. And that's been where I've seen an incredible power. And there's also been a ton of behind the scenes stuff working with staffers and getting them to talk to their elected politician, and so it's not that I'm discounting electoral organizing. I believe in it. I believe it's powerful and important in the dual handle kind of approach that it's in politics, but it's also in community. And so those are my thoughts on Palestinian and Arab-led organizing in my context in Turtle Island.
Thank you, Aaron. I really enjoyed your description of what you're seeing at protests and these community events, because I think it underscores a lot of the what an alternative world could look like for everyone, and then also how anti-Semitism and all these forms of hatred are really just linked together. So thank you so much for that. We're running a little short on time, so we should probably jump a little bit to the advocacy section now. But if there's anything, like, is there anything you want to say to the audience, like one last thing that you would like to share with us?
Just thank you. Thank you all for, as I've said already, but thank you for your witness and thank you for being here and showing up how you can. This is how we do it, this is how we win, is by continuing, because the opposite option is no good. So thank you. And thank you again to Tan and to Sabio.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And feel free to stay if you're busy and you need to leave. You feel free to do that as well. But I just wanted to share a few quick action items from our Kumi Now action page. So let me just link that first, and then I can read out loud some of the things that we're doing. There's some things that aren't on the page, so I'll also talk a little bit about that. And then I'll also stay until like for 10 minutes so that if anyone wants to complete the actions, and then also talk a little bit or discuss any actions that are happening in your communities, you can do that. But for now, there's actually, I think this link is a little outdated, so let me send everyone a new link. There's still ongoing protests, obviously, and even with the election, there's still a lot of protests in the US, even this week. So I want to just send a few links if you want to mobilize your bodies in any way and go to any of the protests. So this is a link for worldwide protests. And there's also a few, I believe, in DC and other US cities as well. So I just want to put that there. In terms of the other actions, we have a few links just in the Kumi Now action page of the petitions that have been circulating for the last few weeks on the page. So I won't like read through all of them again since it's already it's been there for a bit. But there's those campaigns that you can sign on to, and those are the links that you can do that for. And then we're planning to put this on the page as well, but we haven't updated it yet. But we have I'm not sure if people know about this campaign going on, but there's been a few activists that started several months ago eSIMs for Gaza, and actually they just announced yesterday that they're running out of eSIMs. So basically this campaign has been connecting people in Gaza to internet through the purchase of eSIMs, which you can buy on an app. So I'll send you the link for the official link just so you can learn more about this and try if you want to donate money or try to buy an eSIM. They have instructions there. And they also have a upcoming workshop in the next few weeks. If you don't know how to buy an eSIM or you don't know how to do this, they do have a workshop for you to kind of learn. But I just wanted to put the link also there first, just so you can check that out. And then, yeah, I'll leave some space if anyone has anything they want to share in the chat. I'll make sure to send that out to people in the newsletter. And then, yeah, just discussion time. So thank you all for coming and for continuing to be here and being present every week with us.